thanks so much for being with us. You know, last week we had much of our conversation was devoted to the new idea being floated down in Little Rock by Republicans and Democrats alike. They're calling it a private option to Medicaid expansion, and really all it is Obamacare in Arkansas. And we discussed a plethora of issues, of consequences from this. And so when I realized that this was becoming more and more of a reality, I reached out to a man who's been on the program before. His name is Mike Maharrey. He's the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center.com, and he joins us right now via telephone. Mike, thanks so much for being on the program again.
Hey, Paul. It's great to be on. I appreciate it.
I kind of emailed you, and I think in the subject headline it was basically help, because I'm really just wanting to know what do you see? I mean, you're the National Communications Director. I know you guys are in the 10th Amendment Center.com. Your Constitution all the time, every time. Specifically with Obamacare, though, I think the several states have a lot of opportunity here to push back, to maybe reassert their 10th Amendment right. What do you say?
Well, you're absolutely right, but I think what you're seeing in Arkansas is the same thing that we're seeing in a lot of states that you would consider to be more conservative and more apt to push back against Obamacare. And we're seeing this backdoor kind of try to figure out a way to expand the Medicare or the Medicaid system without actually saying we're expanding the Medicaid system. We saw a similar kind of thing going on in Tennessee last week. And I think what is behind this, when you really start to dig down, it's the same thing that's true in a lot of political issues. Follow the money trail. There's a lot of money being thrown around by big hospital corporations, big insurance companies that want to see states expand their Medicaid rolls because they know they're going to get a cut of that money. And it's a short-sighted thing. They probably deep down know that the money spigot isn't going to last forever, but they're looking at short-term solutions over the reality of what we're going to end up in the long run. But this money is really pushing this system, and it's even pushing a lot of people that we would consider conservatives into doing something that I think is just going to perpetuate the disaster that Obamacare is.
Now, you mentioned some of the big corporations, hospitals that are having shortfalls and they need the money. What do you think the cause of that is? And maybe more importantly, they're wanting the government to come in and give them the short-term fix, like you said. Do you think any of them recognize that maybe the government is the one that has placed them in this position in the first place?
I don't know if they think that long-term or not. I think they look at bottom lines and dollar signs, to be honest with you, especially these larger corporations. And I'm not even sure that they're necessarily, quote-unquote, need the money. They just see another great revenue stream, and they're looking at bottom lines. They're looking at their own bonuses. They're looking at growing their own little fiefdoms, and they recognize that the federal government can provide them with a nice revenue stream that's pretty constant and pretty safe and secure, and they're willing to tap into that. And, you know, maybe there's some naivete in that, thinking, oh, if we can fix this, it'll keep going, or maybe they really don't care. I don't know, but I do know that this is a reality in a lot of states. We're definitely seeing this corporate push to expand the Medicaid rolls. And like I said, I think this is part of the Obamacare system. And in reality, states need to do everything that they can to stop Obamacare, to force the federal government to back off of this program before it gets entrenched. Because once it does get entrenched, we are in a heap load of trouble. Yeah,
and really to that, I mean, specifically with Medicaid expansion, some of the Republicans here are talking about with what they're calling a private option, which is really it's really a giant gift with a big fat bow on it to insurance companies, private insurance companies. You know, some are saying that, well, if the government ever changes their pay schedule, meaning the feds, because I think they say they're going to pay 100% for X amount of years, then they're going to ratchet that down. Republicans are saying, well, the legislation that we're crafting, which I'm actually sure, I don't know if we've actually even seen it in text form yet, is going to negate. You know, it will basically cancel the law. If they change any of what they're supposed to pay, we will, if they violate the agreement, we will basically, in the law, have a clause that says in 120 days, everybody who's getting this Medicaid expansion insurance, you know, it'll be taken away. And Mike, I just think, do they really honestly think that the government will have that kind of I don't know, for lack of a better word, constitution to actually follow through? Or are they going to call a special session and, there's no way they're going to take 200,000. In our state, it would be 200,000 people have insurance one day and 120 days later they don't have insurance.
Yeah, that's absurd. And I think anybody that's listening to this show right now knows that would never happen. It's interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day that spent a number of years in England and still has a lot of connections over there. And she was telling me that a lot of people desperately want to overhaul and get rid of the socialized system that they have. But the reality is, at this point, it is so entrenched. Everybody's on it. A third of the population works for some type of company or entity that is attached to it. It is impossible to root it out once its tentacles are brought through the whole society. And you just hit the nail on the head. If these states extend this insurance to these people, then we're going to end up with it forever, for all time, not going to get rid of it. It's just like Social Security. Social Security was supposed to be a little security net for seniors, and now it's grown into basically a retirement system, and we can't get rid of it despite the fact that it's bankrupt. So our position at the 10th Amendment Center is that we need to do everything we can to keep this thing from getting its tentacles into the system. We need to force the federal government to back off of this horrible health care plan, and we need to go back and start looking at free market solutions and state-based solutions where states actually have some control and aren't being dictated everything by the feds. And that's the other side of this. When you start expanding this stuff, then all of a sudden the state is required to pay for all kinds of things that the state doesn't need to be paying for. Certainly we've had the controversy with the abortion provision and stuff like that, but there's all kinds of things when the government starts dictating what is included in insurance. It ratchets up the cost, and it's a giant mess.
Yeah, and it's going to probably result when the federal government, because for the life of me, I can't imagine how any so-called conservative, I want to know what they're drinking. I mean, how have they convinced themselves that they can count on the federal government, when we're $17 trillion in debt and we have everything going on? It's just beyond me. But I would say from a conservative perspective, if you're just looking at the numbers, doing nothing costs the state of Arkansas $1.1 billion over 10 years. Doing their so-called private option costs, I believe, $1.96 billion over 10 years. And if you were to just do the Medicaid expansion as is, in the law Obamacare, it's going to cost us right at $2 billion over 10 years. So there's really not much difference. But actually doing nothing would be better financially for Arkansas. And I think, and tell me what you think, Mike, I think doing nothing, if all the states basically did nothing, that this law would be very, very weak. It might crumble, and we may not have to deal with it at all.
I agree completely. The power of simply not complying is amazing. When you get enough states that simply refuse to implement the exchanges, refuse to expand their Medicaid, the Health Care Act was predicated on this state cooperation. When that's taken away, the feds find themselves in a very difficult position. They don't have the resources. They don't have the manpower to administer this in, all 50 states. Now, clearly some states are going to go along, but even if you can get, 25, 30 states refusing to implement these things, I think that the program itself will wither on the vine. It will force Congress's hand, perhaps to repeal it completely. That's what we ultimately need. We need to get rid of it because, like I said, all we need to do is look at the systems in these other countries and see how destitute and broken that they are, and yet we're plunging ahead to do this. So, yes, we absolutely believe. Don't comply. Do everything you can to block implementation. Certainly don't go along with it. Make the feds do it. We're going to be better off. You're going to be better off fiscally, as you pointed out. And then we have at least a chance of keeping this from getting rooted in our system. Because, like I said, once it's rooted, we will never get rid of it, and we will root the day.
And also, I'll add, from a political perspective, if your goal is to reassert, the sovereignty of the several states, why, not complying. I'm not suggesting, let me say this, I'm not suggesting that if we do nothing, I think fiscally it'll cost us less, obviously, but I'm not suggesting there's not going to be any negative consequences from that. But why not put yourself into a position that if there are negative consequences from just simply not complying, you can make the argument at least that it all rests on the federal government. This is the federal government doing this to us. Versus, I think when you start playing ball with the big bureaucratic mess that Obamacare is, you're going to start blurring the lines as to whose fault it is. And see, I'm for anything that's going to make the federal government seem less legitimate at doing all the things they think that they've got to do in our name.
Well, you're exactly right, and I think maybe that's a good point. And I don't know that I've ever even really thought of it in those terms, but you're right. Let the chips fall where they may. Let the federal government try to administer it, and let the people find out just how horrible it ends up being. But you're right. If the states get involved, the feds are great at passing the buck. It'll be your governor's fault or your legislature's fault or the health department, Little Rock's fault. Who knows what they'll come up with? But yes, put the onus on them. Make them do it. I don't think they can do it. And ultimately what we want is we want the federal government to get as much out of the healthcare business as possible, to bring that back to the state level and let Arkansas figure out within its own borders how it wants to handle its own healthcare system. If we quit sucking all of the money to Washington, D.C., the states would have the resources to deal with healthcare in their own terms. Let 50 states try to figure out different things. Let them find out what works and what doesn't. Let there be a free market of political societies. That's what we really need. This one-size-fits-all centralized system is horrible, and not only horrible, but dangerous.
Yeah, we're talking with Michael Maharrey. He's the National Communications Director for 10thamendmentcenter.com, and I want to make sure it's just 10th Amendment Center, not the 10th Amendment Center. We do have some websites, purveyors of websites that have the before, so I just want to be clear, folks, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com. We talked about, on our show, we've talked about nullification many times, and with a do-nothing approach, well, it may kind of have the effect of nullifying, but it's not straight up passing a law. I mean, that's personally what I would want, but I'm a kind of a practical guy, and I realize right now in Arkansas, so-called conservatives just took over the legislature for the first time in 138 years. So we may not be ready, and plus you had the whole Brown versus Board of Education, the Little Rock thing here, and so there's a lot of people that I think have Stockholm Syndrome
sure.
from past, because a lot of people say anytime you talk about state sovereignty, they say, well, we know in Arkansas what it's like when you go against what the federal government says. So that's kind of what we're dealing with psychologically here. But I'll just say on your website, I have read of, and I don't remember the exact piece of legislation, but the power of doing nothing can be substantial. I believe there is a national law out there about requirements or specifications when it comes to driver's licenses. And the way I understand it is, Mike, most states have yet to comply with basically a uniform standard of how you print driver's licenses. And every single time it comes up to the date of compliance, the federal government, because nobody has complied, they end up pushing the compliance date a couple years down the road. We could be. I know that Obamacare is a much bigger deal than just driver's license, but the same principle applies, does it not?
Absolutely, and you're referring to the Real ID Act, which was passed under the Bush administration in 2005, and we're now at 2013. And you're absolutely correct. We do not have but a handful of states that are completely in compliance with the Real ID Act. We had 21 states, I believe it was 21, back at the time that the act was passed, that passed legislation, saying we're not going to implement this. They based their reasoning on a number of things, on cost. Some of them based it on the privacy and civil liberty issues, and some of them just on a purely philosophical. Federal government doesn't have this power. And you're right. We've seen the federal government move the benchmarks back, change it, push it back. And so the power of no is extremely, extremely effective. And, we consider noncompliance a form of nullification at the 10th Amendment Center. We define nullification as of any act or set of acts, or I guess this would be lack of action, that has the effect of rendering an act null, void, and ineffective. And so With the Real ID Act, we've seen that. We've seen that with medical marijuana. We have 18 states now that have medical marijuana programs, despite the fact that the federal government says that they can't. That's, I don't even know if you'd call that non-compliant. It's basically just ignoring the federal laws. And my favorite example, and I think probably the most effective in history, and it's a good lesson for those with the Stockholm Syndrome, as you put it, with the civil rights movement of the 1950s, is the fact that northern states refused to comply with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. They passed personal liberty laws, and they said, we're not going to cooperate with slave agents that are trying to ship our people south into slavery. Michigan, for example, in their Personal Liberty Act, they said the federal government can't use our jails to hold escaped fugitive slaves. They went on and said that somebody accused of being an escaped slave was entitled to a jury trial, which is the Fugitive Slave Act said no, that it was basically on the word of the owner. All of the northern states virtually passed these liberty acts, and if you look at the South Carolina Declaration of Causes, when they seceded, they listed northern nullification, and they used the word nullification. Northern nullification of the Fugitive Slave Act was their number one complaint. So it works, and it requires the spine and the backbone and the moral fortitude of the people to get behind it and insist to their legislatures, we don't want this.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I also believe it takes some education, because I believe that there are a lot of legislators here in our own state. I'm sure in legislators all over the country that they simply have not ever been taught that we have this power as citizens, as elected representatives in our state. And that's really the sad part, is that a lot of people would say, well, at least maybe by their thinking, you would assume that they believe that the states are simply, colonies of the federal government. There is no sovereignty anymore among the thoughts of some of our politicians. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree, absolutely. I run into it every day. I feel like I spend two-thirds of my life just arguing with lawyers about the Supremacy Clause. They look at the Supremacy Clause and they interpret that as whatever the federal government does, it gets to do. And the Supremacy Clause actually says that those laws that are passed in pursuance of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Well, if it's not in pursuance of the Constitution, if it's exercising a power that was not delegated, then it's not the supreme law of the land. It's not a law at all. It's a void usurpation of power. And so we have this argument constantly. And, when it comes to noncompliance, it's even more frustrating, because I'm not a big fan of the Supreme Court, but even the Supreme Court has ruled that the states are not required to enforce federal acts or to implement federal regulations for the feds. The feds are responsible for that. We've got two court cases. You've got a New York case that had to do with radioactive waste, where the Supreme Court said no, the federal government can require these laws, which I would argue that, but that's a different issue. But that they cannot require the states to implement them. And then we have the famous Sheriff Mack case, which is Prince versus U.S., where it had to do with the Brady gun law, and the sheriffs were going to be required to do these background checks under the threat of arrest. And a couple of sheriffs sued, and basically the federal government said no, the federal government cannot compel state agents to implement their programs. Ultimately, it's up to the feds to implement their own programs. So we're on absolutely no debate that states do not have to implement, they do not have to comply with these federal acts.
Yeah, I like it, folks. And that just lets you know, folks, Obamacare is terrible for Arkansas, and Medicaid expansion, private or as is Obamacare. And, we talked about all this, Mike. We haven't even discussed the individual mandate. And I would just add, I'll end here, that just on the general principle, why would Arkansans even want, I know there's quote-unquote free money involved, but why would we even want to treat anything like it has some form of legitimacy, any law that requires its citizens to purchase a product on the basis that doing nothing is somehow doing something, when it comes to having to purchase insurance, having to enter into a contract with a private company? You would think that if that is in the law, I don't care how much free money you're throwing at us, we're going to say no just on general principle. I'll give you the last word.
It's insane. And imagine for a minute if the federal government came along and said, we're going to have a national grocery program, and we're going to let Kroger administer it. and you are going to be required by mandate, or else you're going to pay a tax if you don't do your grocery shopping at Kroger. I don't know if you have Kroger there, but
oh yeah, we do.
Kroger
Love it. Yeah.
I would love it because my wife works for Kroger. It'd be great for Kroger to have a monopoly on groceries. And yet, everybody would scream bloody murder, especially those on the left. And yet, these same people have no problem with a federal monopoly on health care. It's absolutely insane. It's no different than a Kroger monopoly on groceries. Monopolies are bad. We need to devolve power back to the states, decentralize, and let the market and competition work.
Michael Maharrey, National Communications Director of the 10thAmendmentCenter.com or 10thAmendmentCenter.com. Thanks so much again for being with us and taking time out of your day. We look forward to doing it again sometime.
Always a pleasure, Paul. Anytime.
All right, folks, got to go to break. We'll be back in just a minute.